The wind cuts across the Volga like a blade. October 1552. You stand on wooden ramparts that have held for centuries, watching an army unlike anything your ancestors could have imagined. 50,000 men. 150 cannon. Siege towers taller than your city's minarets. And at the center of it all, a man who calls himself terrible, not as insult, but as warning. Ivan Vasilevich, Tsar of all Russia, has come to erase the last fragment of the Mongol storm that once swallowed half the world. The Khanate of Kazan, heir to the Golden Horde, successor to Genghis Khan himself, stands on the edge of extinction. This is not just a siege. This is the final battle between two worlds, one rising, one refusing to fall. The story begins not here, not now, but 3 centuries earlier, when Batu Khan's horsemen appeared on the frozen Volga like a plague of iron locusts. The Mongols came in winter when Russian princes thought invasion impossible. They burned Vladimir. They burned Kiev. They turned the greatest cities of Rus into charnel houses, and for 240 years, every Russian prince knelt and paid tribute to the Khans. The historian Janet Martin observes that the Mongol yoke transformed Russia from a collection of squabbling principalities into something darker, more centralized, more desperate for revenge. Moscow grew in that shadow. Moscow learned from its masters. And by 1547, when Ivan crowned himself Tsar, a title borrowed from Caesar, claiming equality with Byzantine emperors, he inherited not just a kingdom, but a mission. Drive the Tatars into the steppe. Reclaim the lands. Erase the humiliation. But Kazan was no minor outpost. The city sat where the Kazanka River joins the Volga, controlling trade routes that stretched from the Baltic to the Caspian, from Siberia to Persia. Its walls, built on a high hill, enclosed mosques and markets, blacksmiths and scholars. The Khanate ruled Tatar, Bashkir, Mari, Chuvash, and Mordvin peoples, a patchwork empire bound together by cavalry tradition and the memory of Mongol invincibility. As historian Charles Halperin notes, the Tatars of Kazan saw themselves as the rightful heirs of the Golden Horde, and the Russians as tribute-paying vassals who had forgotten their place. When Russian merchants traveled the Volga, they paid taxes to Kazan. When border villages burned, it was Kazan's horsemen who lit the fires. The relationship was clear: Russia served. Kazan ruled. Ivan had tried before. In 1547, his first campaign ended in disaster, supply lines collapsed, disease ravaged his army, and autumn rains turned roads into swamps. In 1549, he tried again, besieging Kazan for 3 months before winter forced retreat. Each failure hardened something inside the young Tsar. His advisors whispered that God had abandoned him, that the Tatars were still invincible, that Moscow should accept its station. But Ivan saw something different. He saw that Kazan's strength came from geography. The Volga protected its northern approach, steep ravines guarded the southern walls, and any siege required maintaining supply lines across hostile territory while Tatar cavalry raided at will. So Ivan changed the game. Between 1550 and 1552, Russian engineers built a forward base at Sviazhsk, a fortress constructed in prefabricated sections upstream, then floated down the Volga and assembled in 4 weeks. It was a logistical miracle, allowing Russian armies to operate year-round near Kazan without stretching supply lines to breaking. The military historian Brian Davies describes Sviazhsk as the key that unlocked Kazan, a permanent dagger pointed at the Khanate's heart. Ivan also recruited foreign engineers, German and Italian specialists in siege warfare who brought designs for mobile siege towers, sappers trained in undermining walls, and master gunners who could coordinate artillery bombardment with an intensity the Tatars had never faced. This was not a medieval army. This was an early modern war machine. Inside Kazan, Khan Yadegar understood what was coming. He was young, in his early 20s, but not naive. The historian Ruslan Skrinnikov suggests Yadegar knew the odds were impossible. His garrison numbered perhaps 30,000, including irregulars and civilian militia, against Ivan's professional force of 50,000 infantry, cavalry, artillery, and auxiliary troops from conquered territories. The city's defenses were formidable but dated. Wooden palisades reinforced with earth, stone towers at key points, a Kremlin complex that housed the Khan's palace and the main mosque. Strong enough to repel raids. Not strong enough to withstand what Ivan was bringing. Yadegar sent envoys to the Nogai Horde, to the Crimean Khanate, to the Ottoman Sultan, begging for reinforcements. But the geopolitics had shifted. The Nogais were divided, some tribes already negotiating with Moscow. Crimea was focused on Poland and Lithuania. The Ottomans, though sympathetic, considered Kazan too remote, too expensive to defend. Kazan would stand alone. The Khan gathered his council, grizzled warriors who remembered the old days, clerics who quoted the Quran's promises of paradise for defenders of the faith, merchants who calculated the cost of resistance versus surrender. The consensus was grim. Surrender meant slavery, conversion, the end of Tatar independence. Resistance meant death, but death with honor. They chose the walls. You can imagine that council meeting. Oil lamps casting shadows on painted walls. The smell of lamb and pilaf from kitchens where cooks prepared for siege. Outside, the calls to prayer echoing across the city, 5 times a day, rhythms that had structured life here for generations. Children played in the streets, unaware that their world was ending. Blacksmiths worked overtime, repairing armor, forging arrowheads. Women stockpiled grain, salted meat, dried fruit. Everyone understood. When Ivan arrived, there would be no negotiation. The terrible Tsar had made his intentions clear in messages delivered to the city: submit or be annihilated. On August 20th, 1552, Ivan's army appeared on the horizon. You hear them before you see them, the low rumble of thousands of boots, the creak of wagon wheels, the clank of armor and weapons. Then the banners rise over the hills. The double-headed eagle of Moscow, black on gold. Icons of St. Michael and St. George, carried by priests in procession. Regimental flags in crimson and blue. And at the center, surrounded by his personal guard in gleaming plate armor, Ivan himself. 22 years old. Tall, with a thin beard and eyes that burn with something between faith and madness. He rides a black horse bred for war, and when he gestures toward Kazan, his commanders begin the intricate dance of deployment. The Russian army spreads across the landscape like a slow-moving flood. Infantry units, streltsy armed with arquebuses, pike formations trained to hold against cavalry charges, dig in along the western approaches. Artillery parks establish firing positions on elevated ground, cannon crews manhandling guns into place, calculating angles, preparing powder charges. Cavalry patrols range wide, cutting off escape routes and foraging for supplies. Engineers scout the terrain, marking where siege towers will advance, where mines will be dug. This is not the chaotic mob warfare of earlier centuries. This is systematic, methodical, terrifying in its precision. The chronicler Andrei Kurbsky, who fought in this campaign, writes that the army moved like a single organism, each part knowing its function, executing orders with discipline that would have impressed Roman legions. Inside Kazan, defenders watch from the walls. They see the scale of what they face and understand, perhaps for the first time, that this is not a raid or a punitive expedition. This is extermination warfare. Ivan has brought his entire military capacity to bear on one objective. Yadegar orders the gates sealed, drawbridges raised, every able-bodied man to the ramparts. Archers string their composite bows, tested and refined over centuries of steppe warfare. Horsemen prepare for sorties, quick strikes to harass besiegers, disrupt siege works, buy time. But time for what? No relief force is coming. The city's fate will be decided by walls, by courage, by how long men can endure what is about to begin. The first cannon fires at dawn on August 23rd. You feel it in your chest before you hear it, a concussion that rattles teeth and sends birds exploding from trees. Then the sound arrives, a rolling boom that echoes off the river and hills. A stone ball arcs through the sky, seems to hang suspended for an eternal second, then crashes into the wooden palisade with a sound like the world splitting. Splinters fly. Dust rises. Before the defenders can react, the second gun fires. Then the third. Then the entire artillery park erupts in a sustained bombardment that will not stop, day or night, for the next 5 weeks. The rhythm of siege warfare is not what songs and stories suggest. There are no grand charges every hour, no constant clashing of steel. Instead, there is grinding, methodical destruction. The cannon fire in carefully timed sequences, one battery thunders while another cools and reloads. Russian gunners, trained by Italian masters, understand the mathematics of collapse. They do not aim randomly. They target the same sections of wall, hour after hour, day after day, until wood splinters, earth crumbles, and gaps appear. The defenders rush to repair breaches at night, dragging timber and earth under cover of darkness, but each morning the bombardment resumes, undoing their work. It is Sisyphean labor, and everyone knows it. The historian John Fennell notes that Ivan's artillery train at Kazan represented the largest concentration of firepower yet assembled in Eastern European warfare, 150 guns ranging from massive siege cannon to lighter field pieces, coordinated in a systematic program of demolition that anticipated the industrial sieges of later centuries. Inside the city, life contracts. Families abandon homes near the walls, crowding into the center where stone buildings offer some protection. The constant noise, the boom of cannon, the crash of impact, the screams when a ball finds human targets, becomes a psychological weapon as potent as the physical destruction. Children stop crying after the first week, too exhausted by fear. The elderly sit in doorways, expressionless, watching their world disintegrate. Yadegar moves constantly, appearing on different sections of wall, praising defenders, offering silver coins to those who perform acts of exceptional courage. He knows morale is a resource as finite as gunpowder, and it depletes with every casualty, every collapsed tower, every failed sortie. The sorties are desperate, beautiful, doomed. Tatar horsemen burst from hidden gates at dawn or dusk, thundering toward Russian siege works with sabers raised and war cries that carry the echo of centuries. They ride like their ancestors rode, low in the saddle, controlling horses with their knees, firing arrows at full gallop with accuracy that seems superhuman. They crash into Russian positions, killing laborious, scattering supply wagons, setting fire to siege equipment before vanishing back toward the walls. For brief moments, they remind everyone watching that these are the people who conquered half the known world, whose grandfathers' grandfathers rode with Genghis Khan from Mongolia to Hungary. But each sortie costs men Kazan cannot replace. Russian casualties are replaced from reserves. Tatar casualties diminish an already outnumbered garrison. After 2 weeks, the sorties become less frequent, then stop entirely. The defenders retreat behind their walls and wait for the inevitable. Ivan establishes his command post on a low hill within sight of the main gate. He attends morning prayers with his priests, then spends hours consulting with his military council, Prince Alexander Gorbatushuski, who commands the right wing, Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky, leading the left, and the German engineer Rosmissel, whose sappers are digging the mines that will ultimately decide the siege. The Tsar is hands-on, obsessive about details. He reviews casualty reports, inspects artillery positions, questions scouts about Tatar movements. At night, he writes letters to monasteries across Russia, requesting prayers for victory. He fasts, sometimes for days, believing that spiritual purity will earn divine favor. His closest advisor, the priest Sylvester, later writes that Ivan seemed possessed during the siege, driven by a conviction that God had chosen him personally to break the Tatar yoke. Whether this was faith or megalomania, it produced focus. Ivan would not retreat. He would not negotiate. Kazan would fall or he would die trying. September arrives with autumn rains. The Volga rises, flooding low-lying Russian positions. Trenches fill with water. Supply wagons sink axle-deep in mud. Disease appears in the camps, dysentery, typhus, fevers that kill silently. Ivan's army, so impressive in August, begins to fray. Desertion becomes a problem. Men from distant provinces, conscripted for a campaign they were promised would last weeks, not months, slip away at night. Ivan responds with brutal discipline. Deserters are hanged in view of both armies, their bodies left on display as warnings. It works, but resentment builds. Inside Kazan, defenders notice the changes. They see Russian soldiers moving slower, siege works advancing less quickly. Hope flickers. Perhaps the weather will save them. Perhaps Ivan will be forced to withdraw before winter makes operations impossible. But Ivan has learned from his earlier failures. His logistics are unprecedented. Supply trains arrive from Sviazhsk daily, carrying grain, gunpowder, fresh troops. Engineers construct drainage systems, corduroy roads, covered shelters for siege equipment. The army does not break. It bends, adapts, persists. And beneath the surface, literally, Rosmissel's sappers are executing the plan that will end the siege. They dig tunnels toward Kazan's walls, working in shifts around the clock, shoring tunnels with timber, removing earth in baskets carried back through winding passages. The digging is claustrophobic, terrifying work. Tunnels collapse, burying men alive. Defenders sometimes detect the digging and countermine, breaking into Russian tunnels for savage underground combat fought by torchlight in spaces so narrow men cannot raise swords. But slowly, methodically, the Russian tunnels advance. By late September, they have positioned 11 mines beneath key sections of Kazan's defenses. Each mine chamber is packed with gunpowder, tons of it, quantities that make even experienced soldiers nervous. The historian Chester Dunning describes these mines as representing a technological turning point, the moment when siege warfare transitioned from medieval battering and bombardment to explosive demolition. The engineers carefully calculate the charges, considering soil composition, wall construction, desired blast radius. Too little powder and the walls stand. Too much and the explosion might kill attacking Russian troops. Rosmissel stakes his reputation on the calculations. Ivan stakes his campaign. On October 1st, Ivan orders a general assault to test the defenses. Drums roll. Trumpets blare. 10,000 Russian infantry advance across open ground toward Kazan's western walls. They carry scaling ladders, shields, arquebuses. Artillery provides covering fire, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. But as the Russians close, Tatar archers rise from behind battered ramparts and release. Arrows fall like black rain. Men drop screaming, shafts punched through armor and flesh. The assault falters, then breaks. Survivors retreat, leaving hundreds dead in the mud. It is a disaster, and Ivan's commanders are furious, demanding to know why they were ordered into a frontal assault against intact defenses. Ivan does not explain. Only his inner circle knows the truth. The assault was a feint, designed to concentrate Tatar forces on the western wall while final preparations for the mines proceed elsewhere. October 2nd dawns cold and clear. Frost glitters on the ground. You can see your breath in the pre-dawn darkness. Russian soldiers stand in formation, silent, watching the walls. Inside Kazan, defenders sense something different about this morning. The bombardment has stopped. After 6 weeks of constant thunder, the silence is unnerving. Yadegar walks the ramparts, trying to read the Russian intentions. He sees troops massed but not advancing, artillery crews standing idle, engineers gathered in groups pointing at the walls. Something is wrong. He orders his men to full alert, archers to their positions, cavalry to mount and prepare for sorties. But he cannot guess what is coming because no one in this part of the world has experienced anything like it. At 10 in the morning, Rosmissel gives the signal. Engineers light fuses in 11 separate locations, long, slow-burning fuses that allow the sappers time to evacuate the tunnels. Minutes pass. The fuses burn through darkness, approaching the powder chambers. Then the world ends. The first explosion erupts beneath Kazan's main water supply tower. A column of flame and earth shoots skyward, 300 feet high, carrying stone blocks and human bodies. The blast is so loud it deafens men a mile away. Before the debris falls, the second mine detonates. Then the third. Then all 11 in a rolling sequence of destruction that lasts 30 seconds and transforms Kazan's defenses into a landscape of craters and rubble. The chronicler Kurbsky, watching from the Russian lines, writes that the earth shook like an earthquake, that smoke and dust rose so thick it blotted out the sun, that the screams of dying men were swallowed by the roar of collapsing walls. When the smoke clears, Kazan is broken. Entire sections of the western and northern walls have vanished, replaced by gaps 50 feet wide. The water tower is gone, cutting off the city's main spring. Hundreds of defenders are dead, buried under rubble or killed by the blast. Survivors stagger through the wreckage, bleeding from ears and noses, disoriented by the concussive force. And through the gaps, like a flood through a shattered dam, the Russian army comes. This is the moment. This is when medieval siege warfare meets the future. Ivan's assault troops have been positioned for this exact scenario. They surge forward in disciplined waves, not the chaotic mob of earlier assaults but organized units with specific objectives. Streltsy formations advance first, arquebuses firing volleys to suppress Tatar archers. Behind them, pike units move through the breaches, securing footholds. Cavalry circles the flanks, cutting off retreat routes. And behind them all, thousands more, peasant levies, auxiliary troops, foreign mercenaries, all pouring toward the broken city like wolves toward wounded prey. The Tatars fight with the courage of men who know they are dying. They meet the Russians in the rubble, turning every collapsed tower into a fortress, every street into a killing ground. Archers fire from rooftops. Cavalry charges down narrow alleys, trampling infantry. Defenders hurl stones, burning all, anything they can find. The fighting is intimate and terrible, men grappling in the dust, daggers seeking throats, axes crushing skulls. The historian Isabel de Madariaga observes that the final assault on Kazan resembled less a battle than a massacre, but a massacre in which the victims refused to surrender, fighting room by room, house by house, until the streets ran red. Yadegar rallies his remaining forces near the Kremlin, the fortified heart of the city. Perhaps 2,000 Tatar warriors remain combat effective, backed by armed civilians and the Khan's personal guard. They form a defensive perimeter around the main mosque, preparing for a last stand. Yadegar, his armor dented and blooded, his face blackened by smoke, addresses his men. The exact words are lost, but Tatar chronicles preserved in later generations speak of a speech that invoked ancestors, honor, faith. He reminds them they are heirs to Genghis Khan, that their grandfathers conquered empires, that dying well is the only nobility left to them. Then he draws his saber and waits for the Russians to come. They come in waves, crashing against the Kremlin defenses like surf against rocks. The first wave is streltsy, arquebuses firing in rotation, one rank shooting while another reloads, maintaining constant pressure. Their bullets chip stone, shatter wood, find flesh. But the Tatars are dug in, positioned behind makeshift barricades of furniture, carts, corpses. They return fire with arrows and captured firearms, making the Russians pay for every foot of ground. Bodies pile in the narrow approaches to the Kremlin square. The wounded crawl backward, leaving blood trails. The dead are trampled by those coming behind. This is not warfare as art or science. This is butchery, and it continues for hours. Prince Gorbaty-Shuisky leads the second wave personally, dismounting to fight alongside his men. He is a veteran of decades of border wars, respected by his troops, and his presence steadies the assault. Russian infantry push forward behind large wooden shields, portable walls that protect them from arrows, while engineers with axes and crowbars work to dismantle the barricades. The Tatars respond with desperate sorties, small groups bursting from cover to strike Russian flanks before retreating. One such sortie nearly reaches Gorbaty-Shuisky himself. 3 Tatar horsemen thunder into the Russian formation, sabers whirling, and the prince's bodyguards barely intercept them in time. The horsemen are cut down, but not before killing 7 Russians and wounding twice that number. Their bodies are left where they fall, obstacles that the next wave must step over. Inside the Kremlin compound, Yadegar watches his forces dissolve. He has no reserves. Every man who can hold a weapon is already committed. The civilians, women, children, elderly, huddle in the mosque, praying for deliverance that will not come. Some warriors argue for surrender, for negotiating terms that might save the non-combatants. But Yadegar knows Ivan's reputation. The terrible Tsar does not negotiate. He conquers. Offering surrender now would only hasten the inevitable massacre. Better to fight, to make the Russians bleed for their victory, to ensure that Kazan's fall is remembered not as cowardice but as tragedy. The Khan gives his final order: every man fights to the death. There will be no surrender. No captives. No mercy asked or given. The Russian assault intensifies as afternoon shadows lengthen. Artillery pieces are manhandled through the breached walls, positioned to fire directly into the Kremlin at point-blank range. The first volley shatters the Kremlin's main gate, reducing ornate wooden doors to splinters. The second volley crashes into a tower, toppling its upper section and burying the defenders positioned there. The third finds the mosque itself, punching through one wall and detonating inside with a concussion that collapses part of the roof. The screams from within are terrible: women and children torn apart by stone shrapnel, crushed by falling beams, burned by ignited tapestries. It is a horror that will haunt even hardened soldiers in the years after. But Ivan has authorized no restraint. Kazan must be utterly broken, its resistance annihilated so completely that no other Tatar Khanate will dare oppose Moscow in the future. The final Russian wave breaks through around 4 in the afternoon. Thousands of infantry pour into the Kremlin square, overwhelming the last defenders through sheer numerical superiority. The fighting becomes individual duels, clusters of men hacking at each other with swords and axes, wrestling in the blood-slicked stones. Yadegar fights in the center, surrounded by his guard, a man possessed. Kurbsky, who enters the Kremlin with the Russian troops, later writes that the young Khan fought like a demon, his saber a blur, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and battle cries. He kills 3 Russians personally before a pike thrust catches him in the side, punching through armor and into flesh. He staggers but does not fall, killing the pikeman with a backhanded slash before another Russian soldier clubs him from behind. Yadegar drops to his knees, blood pouring from a head wound, and is immediately surrounded. There is a moment, brief, frozen, when the fighting pauses. Russian soldiers stand in a circle around the fallen Khan, weapons raised, waiting for someone to deliver the killing blow. Yadegar, kneeling in his own blood, looks up. His face is a mask of gore and defiance. He says something in Tatar, words that the Russian soldiers do not understand but that carry unmistakable weight. Then Prince Vorotinsky pushes through the circle and stops the execution. Not from mercy, but from calculation. A dead Khan is a martyr. A captured Khan is a symbol of submission. Vorotinsky orders Yadegar bound and carried to Ivan's command post. The young Khan is hauled to his feet, hands tied, and dragged from the Kremlin while around him the slaughter continues. The massacre lasts until nightfall. Russian soldiers, brutalized by weeks of siege warfare, their friends and brothers killed by Tatar arrows and sabers, unleash fury on the surviving population. Men are butchered in the streets. Women and children are enslaved or killed, depending on the whims of individual soldiers. The city is looted methodically, gold and silver from merchant houses, silk and spices from warehouses, weapons and armor from dead warriors. Fires break out, whether from accident or design, and by midnight Kazan is burning, flames illuminating scenes of apocalyptic destruction. The historian Maureen Perry notes that the fall of Kazan represented one of the most complete urban destructions of the 16th century, comparable to the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan or the Ottoman capture of Constantinople in the totality of its transformation. Ivan enters the ruined city the following morning, October 3rd. He rides through gates that no longer exist, past walls that have been reduced to rubble, into streets choked with bodies and ash. His face is expressionless. He proceeds to the site of the main mosque, now a burnt shell, and there he orders a Christian chapel erected on its foundation. Priests begin consecration rituals, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water on blood-soaked ground. Icons are raised where Quranic verses once adorned walls. The symbolism is deliberate and absolute. The Tatar presence in Kazan is being erased, overwritten with Russian Orthodox identity. Yadegar is brought before Ivan in chains. The young Khan, wounded and exhausted, stands as straight as his injuries allow. He does not beg. He does not weep. The two men, both in their early 20s, regard each other across a gulf wider than the few feet separating them. They represent worlds that cannot coexist, one rising, one fallen. Ivan speaks first, through an interpreter, offering conversion to Christianity and life, or refusal and death. Yadegar's response is recorded in multiple chronicles with slight variations, but the essence remains consistent. He chooses life, but not because he fears death. He chooses life because his people need witnesses to remember what happened here, because martyrdom without audience is wasted, because someone must carry forward the memory of Kazan's resistance. He converts, is baptized with the name Simeon, and is sent to Moscow where he will live the remainder of his life as a pensioned noble, a living trophy of Ivan's triumph. The aftermath unfolds across months and years. The surviving population of Kazan, perhaps 30,000 before the siege, reduced to fewer than 10,000, is forcibly relocated. Tatars are moved to settlements outside the city, replaced by Russian colonists brought from western provinces. The city itself is rebuilt in Russian style, with Orthodox churches replacing mosques, Russian architecture replacing Tatar design. The Khanate of Kazan ceases to exist as a political entity. Its territories are absorbed into the expanding Russian state. The Volga, for the first time in 3 centuries, becomes a Russian river from source to mouth. The impact radiates outward like ripples from a stone thrown in water. The neighboring Astrakhan Khanate, seeing Kazan's fate, surrenders to Ivan without resistance in 1556. The Siberian Khanate becomes a Russian vassal shortly after. The Crimean Khanate, the most powerful remaining Tatar state, is shocked by Kazan's fall but too distant and too focused on Ottoman politics to effectively respond. Within a generation, Russian power extends to the Caspian Sea, to the Ural Mountains, eventually to the Pacific Ocean. The conquest of Kazan opened Siberia to Russian expansion, initiating a colonial process that will continue for 3 centuries. The historian Janet Martin argues that 1552 represents the true birth of the Russian Empire, not as a date on calendars, but as the moment when Moscow transitions from a regional power paying tribute to Tatars into an expansionist empire subjugating diverse peoples. But the human cost is immeasurable. Tatar society in the Volga region is shattered. Communities that maintained continuity with the Mongol Empire, that preserved traditions and languages connecting them to Central Asian heritage, are disrupted or destroyed. Forced conversions follow the conquest, not universal, but systematic enough to fracture cultural transmission. Islamic institutions are suppressed. Tatar aristocracy is either killed, converted, or marginalized. The survivors adapt, finding ways to preserve identity under Russian rule, but something essential is lost. The historian Michael Khodorkovsky describes the post-1552 period as a time of cultural trauma for Volga Tatars, a wound that shapes identity for generations. For Russia, Kazan becomes a founding myth. Icons depict Ivan as a saint warrior, God's instrument against infidels. Churches commissioned to celebrate the victory, most famously St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, begun in 1555, become architectural symbols of Russian triumph. The conquest is taught to children as proof of divine favor, as the moment when Russia throws off the Mongol yoke and claims its destiny. Ivan himself, for all his later atrocities and descent into paranoid tyranny, is remembered first and foremost as the Tsar who broke Kazan. His title Grozny, translated as terrible, might more accurately be rendered as awe-inspiring or formidable, a man who commands fear and respect in equal measure. Yet there are questions that haunt the victory. Was the massacre necessary? Could terms have been negotiated that preserved life while still achieving strategic objectives? Ivan's defenders argue that showing mercy would have encouraged resistance elsewhere, that only total destruction could break the cycle of Tatar raids and Russian tribute. His critics, and they are many, even in his own time, point to the slaughter of non-combatants, the burning of a city that could have been preserved, the brutality that exceeded military necessity. The debate continues across centuries, and there are no easy answers. War, especially war fought between cultures and religions, follows its own logic of escalation and revenge. In the years immediately following Kazan's fall, Ivan consolidates his hold on the Volga region with a mixture of military occupation and administrative reorganization. Russian fortresses rise at strategic points along the river, wooden stockades initially, later replaced by stone. Garrisons are rotated regularly to prevent soldiers from developing sympathies with local populations. Tax collectors arrive with detailed registers, cataloging resources, assessing tribute obligations. The land itself is surveyed, mapped, divided into administrative districts that bear no relationship to traditional Tatar territorial organization. It is cultural engineering on a massive scale, the deliberate dismantling of one world to construct another. The Tatar survivors adapt in various ways. Some flee eastward into the steppe, joining communities beyond Russian reach, carrying with them stories of Kazan's destruction that become part of oral tradition. Others remain, negotiating the terms of their subjugation. Tatar nobles who convert to Christianity are sometimes allowed to retain lands and status, becoming intermediaries between Russian authority and Tatar subjects. Islamic scholars practice in secret, preserving religious knowledge underground. Merchants continue trading because commerce flows around political structures like water around stones. But the fundamental power dynamic has shifted irreversibly. Where once Tatars commanded and Russians obeyed, now Russians dictate terms and Tatars comply or suffer. The conquest's ripple effects transform Russian military organization. The success at Kazan validates Ivan's investments in artillery, engineering, and foreign expertise. Over the following decades, Russia develops one of Europe's largest standing armies, combining traditional cavalry with modern infantry and siege capabilities. The military historian Richard Helly observes that Kazan represents a turning point in Russian military evolution, the moment when Moscow fully embraces gunpowder technology and systematic logistics as foundations of power. This military modernization enables further conquests, Astrakhan, Siberia, eventually wars against Sweden and Poland that establish Russia as a major European power. But there is another legacy, darker and more enduring. The brutality displayed at Kazan becomes precedent. When Ivan later turns his paranoia against internal enemies, the Oprichnina terror that will kill thousands of Russian nobles and peasants in the 1560s and 1570s, he is following patterns established here. The willingness to destroy utterly, to massacre populations, to prioritize fear over loyalty, all trace back to October 1552. The historian Isabel de Madariaga argues that Kazan gives Ivan a taste for violence that metastasizes into his later reign's horrors. Whether this is fair psychological analysis or retrospective judgment colored by knowledge of Ivan's eventual madness, the connection exists. The terrible Tsar who breaks Kazan becomes the terrible Tsar who breaks Russia itself, and the trajectory begins here, in the smoke and blood of a conquered city. For the Mongol legacy, Kazan's fall marks an ending. The Golden Horde, which once ruled from the Pacific to the Carpathians, which brought terror to Europe and wealth to Asia, which represented the greatest land empire in human history, splinters into fragments after Batu Khan's death. The successor Khanates, Golden Horde, Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, Siberia, maintain connections to that legacy but diminish with each generation. Kazan is the first to fall permanently, and its fall demonstrates that the age of steppe cavalry dominance is ending. Gunpowder, fortifications, centralized states with professional armies, these are the future. The Mongol way of war, brilliant in its mobility and ferocity, cannot adapt quickly enough to survive. Yet the Mongol influence on Russia is profound and lasting. The historian Charles Halperin spends decades studying how Mongol governance shapes Russian political structures. The centralization of power in Moscow, the system of service nobility tied directly to the Tsar, the use of census and taxation modeled on Mongol administration, the diplomatic protocols and court ceremonials, all borrow heavily from the Mongol experience. Russia conquers its Mongol masters but becomes, in some ways, their heir. The very title for Tsar that Ivan claims derives from Caesar, but it also echoes of Khan and his autocratic rulers as much to Genghis Khan as to Constantine. This paradox defines Russian identity, a European power geographically, but shaped by Asian conquest and Asian governance models. The mosque that becomes a church at Kazan center is not demolished but transformed, its minarets replaced by onion domes, its prayer hall reoriented toward Jerusalem instead of Mecca. This physical transformation mirrors the cultural project undertaken across the conquered territories. Tatar children are taught Russian in schools funded by Orthodox monasteries. Conversion incentives, tax breaks, land grants, legal privileges, encourage abandonment of Islam. Yet complete assimilation proves impossible. Tatar identity persists, adapts, survives in altered form. By the 18th century, a distinct Volga Tatar culture emerges, Muslim in faith but Russian in language and many customs, neither fully part of the Russian mainstream nor completely separate from it. This hybrid identity, born from conquest trauma, becomes one of Russia's most complex internal relationships. The wider Islamic world reacts slowly to Kazan's fall. The Ottoman Empire, theoretically the protector of Sunni Muslims worldwide, issues protests but takes no action. The distance is too great, the logistics too complex, and Ottoman attention is focused on Mediterranean and Middle Eastern conflicts. Central Asian Khanates, descendants of Chaghatay's line, are preoccupied with their own internecine conflicts. Only in poetry and religious texts does Kazan's destruction resonate, laments composed by scholars, elegies for a lost city, warnings about the vulnerability of the faithful. The historian Devin Dewis documents how Kazan becomes a symbol in Islamic Central Asian literature, representing the frontiers collapse, the failure to maintain unity against external threats. For Ivan personally, Kazan is his greatest triumph and, in some ways, his curse. He never again achieved such complete victory. The Livonian War, begun in 1558 to gain Baltic access, drags on for 25 years and ends in failure. The Crimean Tatars raid Moscow itself in 1571, burning the city and demonstrating that Tatar power is not entirely broken. Ivan's domestic policies alienate his nobility, fracture his administration, and create instability that will lead to the time of troubles after his death. He dies in 1584, having killed his own son in a rage, leaving his empire to a weak heir and uncertain succession. But in 1552, riding through Kazan's ruins, he is young, victorious, convinced of his divine mandate. That moment, that conviction, shapes everything that follows. The soldiers who fought at Kazan carry their experiences into old age. Some return to farms and villages, trying to resume normal lives but haunted by memories of the siege. Others remain in the army, fighting in Ivan's subsequent wars, until injury or age forces retirement. A few become officers, rising through ranks, their expertise in siege warfare valuable as Russia expands. The Tatar veterans who survive integration into Russian service bring their own perspectives, men who fought for Kazan, saw their city destroyed, and now serve the conqueror because no alternatives exist. Their stories are rarely recorded, but they exist in the margins of chronicles, in passing references to Tatar auxiliaries fighting for Russia in later campaigns. The demographic transformation of the Volga region takes generations to complete. Russian colonists settle slowly, deterred by distance, harsh climate, and lingering dangers from steppe raiders. For decades after 1552, the area remains thinly populated, a borderland where Russian authority is theoretical rather than practical. Gradually, through systematic colonization programs, tax incentives, and military settlement, Russian populations increase. By the 17th century, the Volga is recognizably Russian in character, dotted with Orthodox churches and Russian-speaking towns. But Tatar villages persist in the countryside, maintaining languages and customs, preserving memories of a time before the conquest. In historical memory, Kazan occupies different spaces for different peoples. Russian historiography, particularly during the Soviet period, frames the conquest as progressive, the necessary step in building a multi-ethnic state, an act of unification rather than destruction. This interpretation, while politically convenient, obscures the violence and cultural loss involved. Tatar historiography, when allowed to exist, tells a different story of a sophisticated urban civilization destroyed by barbarism, of cultural heritage erased, of a tragedy that reverberates through subsequent centuries. Both narratives contain truth. Both are incomplete. The reality exists in the space between, in the complexity of conquest and survival, resistance and adaptation. The archaeological record provides physical evidence of the transformation. Excavations in modern Kazan reveal layers of destruction, burned timbers, collapsed walls, mass graves hastily dug after the siege. Below these layers lie evidence of a thriving medieval city, pottery, metalwork, architectural remnants showing sophisticated craft traditions and international trade connections. Above the destruction layers, Russian artifacts appear, different pottery styles, different architectural techniques, different cultural markers. The stratigraphic sequence tells its own story, independent of chronicles and political interpretations. It speaks of ending and beginning, death and rebirth, the violent remaking of urban space. For students of military history, Kazan offers lessons about the transition from medieval to early modern warfare. The siege demonstrates how gunpowder weapons, when properly deployed with adequate logistics and engineering support, can overcome fortifications that would have withstood medieval siege techniques. The mines that break Kazan's walls represent technological sophistication absent from earlier Russian campaigns. The sustained bombardment shows organizational capacity. Maintaining artillery fire for 6 weeks requires supply chains, powder production, gun maintenance, and coordination that indicate state capacity beyond feudal norms. These are the signatures of early modernity, visible here in 1552 at the edge of Europe and Asia. Yet the human element remains decisive. Without Yadegar's decision to resist, Kazan might have negotiated surrender terms that preserved lives and some autonomy, as other cities did when faced with overwhelming force. Without Ivan's obsessive determination, Russian armies might have withdrawn during September's difficulties, as they had in previous campaigns. Without the courage of both side soldiers, Tatars fighting hopelessly but honorably, Russians enduring siege hardships without collapse, the outcome might have differed. Technology shapes possibilities, but human choices within those possibilities determine outcomes. The final question, the one that echoes across centuries, is whether any of this was inevitable. Could the Golden Horde's successor states have unified, presenting a combined front that Russia could not overcome? Could diplomacy have produced a settlement that preserved Tatar independence while addressing Russian security concerns? Could Kazan have adapted its defenses, sought different allies, pursued different strategies? The answers are unknowable, but the questions matter because they remind us that history is not predetermined. Kazan fell because of specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances. Different decisions might have produced different outcomes. The siege, the battle, the conquest, all resulted from choices, and choices imply agency, responsibility, consequence. As night falls over the Volga on October 3, 1552, smoke still rises from Kazan's ruins. Bodies are being collected for mass burial. Survivors huddle in makeshift shelters, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what has happened. Russian soldiers celebrate victory with looted wine, singing songs that will become part of military tradition. Ivan kneels in prayer, thanking God for delivering his enemies into his hands. And somewhere in the darkness, Yadegar, now Simeon, sits in chains, contemplating the future of a people whose past has been violently severed. The Volga flows on, indifferent to human tragedy, carrying water from the interior to the Caspian as it has for millennia and will for millennia more. Empires rise and fall along its banks. Peoples come and go. Cities are built, destroyed, rebuilt. But this moment, this October evening in 1552, marks a turning point whose effects reach forward through centuries to shape nations, cultures, identities. The Battle of Kazan ends. Its consequences are only beginning.